In the far northwest of Essos, where the narrow sea meets the shivering sea, sits a city unlike any other in the known world. Braavos, the secret city. A place born not from conquest or ancient bloodlines, but from the desperate flight of slaves who refused to bow. And in the heart of that city, behind walls of black stone and iron-banded doors, sits an institution more powerful than most kingdoms, the Iron Bank of Braavos. To understand the Iron Bank's role in Westeros, we must first understand what it is, and more importantly, what it is not. The Iron Bank is not a palace. It does not gleam with gold or drip with jewels like the counting houses of Volantis or Korth. When you approach the Iron Bank, you see a massive building of grey stone, plain and severe. No banners fly from its towers, no guards in bright armour stand at its gates, just iron. Cold, hard, unyielding iron in every door, every lock, every chain. The message is clear before you ever step inside. This is a place of absolutes, of accounts that must balance, of debts that will be paid. The bank's origins lie in Braavos itself, and you cannot separate one from the other. Braavos was founded by escaped slaves who stole ships from Valyria during the height of the freehold's power. These were not warriors or nobles. They were oarsmen, craftsmen, servants, people who knew the value of every copper because they had been bought and sold like cattle. They sailed into the mists of the northern seas and found a lagoon of 100 islands. There, hidden from the dragon lords who would hunt them, they built their city. From the very beginning, Braavos was different. There would be no slaves in the secret city. No man would bow to another because of birth or blood. But freedom alone does not build walls or buy food. The early Braavosi needed coin. They needed trade. They needed a way to turn their skills and their position into power. So they created the Iron Bank. The first keyholders of the Iron Bank were said to be 16 men and 7 women, former slaves from a dozen different lands. Some had been scribes who knew numbers. Others had been merchants who understood trade. A few had been nothing more than galley slaves who remembered every cruel lesson about debt and payment. Together, they pooled what little they had and created something new. Not a moneylender serving one master, not a trading company loyal to one family, but a bank. An institution that would outlive any single person. An institution with one simple rule. The Iron Bank will have its due. Those words are not a promise. They are not a threat. They are simply a fact, as certain as winter following summer, as unchangeable as the tide. When the Iron Bank lends you gold, that gold will return to the bank. One way or another, whether you pay it back yourself, or whether your heirs pay it, or whether your enemies pay it after they pull you from your throne, the debt will be settled. The account will balance. This is what makes the Iron Bank different from every other lender in the world. In Westeros, when a lord borrows from another lord, there are complications. Personal relationships, old grudges, marriage alliances, political considerations. A Lannister might forgive a debt to win a friend. A Tyrell might write off a loan to gain influence. The faith might show mercy to the pious. But the Iron Bank shows no mercy. The Iron Bank has no friends. The Iron Bank does not care if you are a good man or a monster. It does not care if your cause is just or your war is holy. It cares only about one thing. Can you repay what you borrowed? If the answer is yes, the Iron Bank will lend to you again. If the answer is no, the Iron Bank will destroy you. How does a bank destroy a king? Not with swords, not with armies of its own. The Iron Bank employs no sellsword companies. It raises no banners. Yet its power to topple crowns is very real, and it comes from understanding a simple truth. Every throne rests on gold. When a king needs to raise an army, he needs gold to pay his soldiers. When he needs to buy the loyalty of doubtful lords, he needs gold for bribes and gifts. When he needs to keep his people from starving through a hard winter, he needs gold to buy grain from across the sea. Take away that gold, and the throne begins to crack. The Iron Bank has many tools. The most obvious is simply refusing to lend more money. A king who cannot borrow, cannot wage war, cannot buy food, cannot keep his court running. But the bank has sharper tools than this. The bank can call in its debts, demand immediate payment, force a king to raise taxes or seize lands or sell off crown properties just to meet his obligations. This makes the king hated, makes his lords restless, makes his people hungry. And a hated king on a crumbling throne is easy prey for ambitious rivals. And here is where the Iron Bank shows its true genius. If you will not pay your debts, the bank will find someone who will. Your enemies, your rivals, anyone who might take your crown and prove more reliable. The Iron Bank will lend them gold, will give them the means to raise armies and buy sellswords and bribe your own bannermen, will help them pull you down from your high seat. And when they sit on your throne, their first act will be to honor the debts you refused, to pay back the Iron Bank, because they know what happens to those who do not. This is not cruelty. This is not even revenge. It is simply business. The Iron Bank backed your rival not because they hated you, but because you made yourself a bad investment. You proved unreliable, and the Iron Bank cannot afford to be lenient with the unreliable. If it forgave one debt, others would refuse to pay. If it showed mercy once, every desperate king would demand mercy. The entire system would collapse. So the Iron Bank never forgives, never forgets, never shows mercy. This ruthless consistency is what gives the bank its real power. Every lord and king in Essos knows that the Iron Bank will have its due. So when the Iron Bank offers them a loan, they take it seriously. When the Iron Bank sets terms, they honor those terms. Not because they love the bank, but because they fear what happens if they do not. And that fear is worth more than 1,000 armies. The Iron Bank's reach extends across all of Essos, from the free cities to the far ports of Korth and beyond. Wherever there is trade, there is gold. Wherever there is gold, there is debt. And wherever there is debt, the Iron Bank has influence. Sea captains borrow to outfit their ships. Merchants borrow to fill their warehouses. Magisters borrow to fund their elections. Princes borrow to fight their wars. All of them know the same truth. The Iron Bank will have its due. But for most of its history, the Iron Bank's influence in Westeros was limited. Not because the bank lacked interest, but because Westeros had been largely stable. The Targaryen kings who united the 7 kingdoms and ruled for 300 years were many things, but they were rarely poor. They had the wealth of the crown lands, the taxes from every kingdom, the gold mines of the Westerlands through their Lannister allies, and most importantly, they had dragons. Dragons change everything. A king with dragons does not need to borrow gold to secure his throne. His throne is secured by fire and blood. His lords obey not because he can outspend them, but because he can burn them. For 3 centuries, the Iron Throne was stable. Wars were fought, rebellions rose and fell, but the Targaryens endured, and a stable throne has little need for foreign bankers. Still, the Iron Bank was patient. It understood that all dynasties end, all dragons die. And when the Targaryens weakened, when their dragons vanished from the world, and their grip on the throne grew uncertain, the bank would be ready. The first significant loans to Westeros came during the later Targaryen reigns. Kings who wanted to build grand, projects, lords who needed to repair their castles after wars, merchants in the great cities who sought to expand their trade, small amounts at first, careful investments. The Iron Bank was feeling out the market, learning the players, understanding how power worked in this strange land across the narrow sea, where birth mattered more than coin. What the Iron Bank learned was simple. Westerosi nobility looked down on trade. They called merchants and bankers lowborn, no matter how rich. They valued ancient bloodlines over full coffers. This made them proud. It also made them foolish. Because they did not respect gold the way they should, did not fear debt the way the wise fear it. They borrowed as if the gold was a gift, as if their noble blood meant they could not be held to account like common men. The Iron Bank noted this and waited. By the time Aerys II sat the Iron Throne, the last Targaryen king, the crown had borrowed from the Iron Bank before. Modest sums. Always repaid, though, sometimes slowly. The relationship was cordial, but distant. The Iron Bank was one lender among many. Useful, but not essential. The crown still had its own wealth, still had the taxes, still had enough gold flowing in to meet its needs without grovelling to foreign bankers. But the Iron Bank could see the cracks forming, could see the madness growing in Aerys, could see the realm growing unstable. And it knew that unstable realms need gold. Desperate kings make desperate bargains, and desperate bargains are where the Iron Bank does its finest work. The employees of the Iron Bank are not like the merchants and moneylenders of other cities. They do not dress in silk or cover themselves in rings and chains. They wear dark robes, simple, severe, practical. They speak quietly and precisely, every word measured, every number exact. When an envoy of the Iron Bank arrives at a foreign court, he does not come with gifts or flattery. He comes with ledgers, with records, with exact accounting of what is owed and what is due. His voice is calm, his manner is cold, and his message is always the same. The Iron Bank will have its due. These men, these keyholders and envoys, are carefully chosen. They serve the bank, not themselves. Their loyalty is not to any family or any city or any king. Their loyalty is to the institution, to the principle, to the certainty that debts must be paid. When one dies, another takes his place. The names change, but the bank remains. Eternal, unchanging, inevitable. This is the power that began to look toward Westeros with greater interest as Aerys III's reign collapsed into rebellion and fire. This is the power that would, in time, hold the fate of the Seven Kingdoms in its ledgers. This is the power that doesn't conquer with swords, but with something far more binding, gold, and the debts that gold creates. The lords of Westeros did not understand this yet. They saw the Iron Bank as just another moneylender, useful when needed, ignorable when not. They would learn. They would all learn the truth that every free city already knew, that every merchant prince and magister understood in his bones. The Iron Bank will have its due, and no throne in the world is high enough to escape that reckoning. The year was 281 AC, when the realm began to tear itself apart. At Harrenhal, during the Great Tourney, Crown Prince Rhaegar Targaryen crowned Lyanna Stark the Queen of Love and Beauty instead of his own wife. Within a year, Lyanna was gone. Brandon Stark rode to King's Landing demanding Rhaegar's head. Aerys the Soond burned him alive, along with his father Lord Rickard. The Mad King then demanded that Jon Arryn surrender his wards, Robert Baratheon and Ned Stark, for execution. Jon Arryn refused, and the realm exploded into war. This is the story every child in Westeros knows, the story of Robert's rebellion, the story of how the Targaryens fell and the Baratheons rose. But there is another story beneath that one, a story written in gold and debt, a story that begins with a simple question. How does a rebellion pay for itself? Robert Baratheon was young, strong, charismatic, a warrior who could rally men to his cause with a smile and a warhammer. But smiles do not forge steel. Warhammers do not buy grain. And men, even loyal men, need to eat, need weapons, need armor, need horses. An army is not just courage and loyalty. An army is thousands of mouths that must be fed every single day. Thousands of bodies that must be clothed and armed and sheltered. And all of that requires one thing above all else: gold. Robert was Lord of Storm's End, not a poorhouse by any measure. The Stormlands had their wealth, their keeps, and their lands. But Robert was also facing the united power of the Iron Throne, facing the wealth of the Crown Lands, the might of the Reach with all its golden fields, the strength of Dorne. These were kingdoms, entire regions with treasuries built up over generations. Robert had one castle and the lands. Around it, he needed allies, he needed armies, and he needed them quickly. Jon Arryn raised the Vale, Ned Stark raised the North. These were powerful friends, but the Vale and the North, for all their strength in men, were not rich in gold. The Vale had its own stores, carefully managed by Jon Arryn over long years. The North was vast but harsh, with more mouths to feed than gold to spare. Neither could simply open their treasuries and pour out endless coin to fund a war against the crown. They had their own people to think of, their own needs, their own limits. So where did the gold come from? How did Robert and his allies pay for the rebellion that toppled a dynasty 300 years old? Some came from the lords themselves. Every great house that joined Robert's cause contributed what they could. The Tullys of Riverrun, the Starks of Winterfell, the Arryns of the Eyrie, they opened their treasuries, melted down their plate, sold off what they could spare. But this was not enough. Not nearly enough. Wars are expensive. Long wars are ruinous, and no one knew how long this war would last. Some gold came from seizure. When Robert's forces took a castle loyal to the Targaryens, they took its wealth as well. Every keep they captured, every town that bent the knee, the wealth flowed to the rebel cause. But this too had limits. You cannot bleed your new subjects dry and expect them to remain loyal. You cannot take everything and still claim to be their rightful king. There had to be some restraint, some mercy, which meant there had to be another source of gold. The crown itself had borrowed before, from the faith of the Seven, from the Lannisters, from wealthy merchants in the free cities, and yes, from the Iron Bank of Braavos. These debts existed before the rebellion began. Aerys II had not been a wise steward of the realm's wealth. He had his obsessions, his madness, his grand plans that required gold. The crown's debt had grown during his reign, though it was nothing compared to what would come later. When the rebellion began, these creditors faced a choice: continue to support the crown, support the rebels, or stay neutral and wait to see who won. The faith, being based in Westeros itself, had little choice but to continue backing the Iron Throne. Their seat was in Old Town. Their septons and sceptres were spread across the realm. They could not openly side with rebels without risking everything. So they stayed with Aerys, praying perhaps that the gods would sort things out. The Lannisters, ever cunning, did neither. Tywin Lannister stayed in Casterly Rock, kept his armies home, watched and waited. He had served as Hand of the King for years under Aerys before being dismissed and insulted. He had no love for the Mad King, but he also had no certainty that Robert would win. So Tywin waited. Let others bleed. Let the outcome become clear before he committed his gold or his men. This was caution. This was wisdom. This was the Lannister way. But the Iron Bank worked differently. The Iron Bank did not care about loyalty to crowns or causes. The Iron Bank cared about one thing: which side could repay its loans, which side was the better investment. And as the rebellion dragged on, as Aerys grew more erratic and more isolated, the answer became clear. The Mad King was a bad risk. His support was crumbling. His grip on power was weakening. He had burned men alive for imagined slights. He had driven away his own hand. He had made enemies of half the realm. This was not a man you could trust to sit securely on his throne. This was not a man who would be around to honour his debts. Robert Baratheon, on the other hand, was winning. Slowly, bloodily, but winning nonetheless. He had the North, he had the Vale, he had the Riverlands, after Hoster Tully joined the cause and married his daughters to the Stark and Arryn heirs. He had the Stormlands by birthright. That was 4 of the 7 kingdoms. 4 kingdoms against 3. And of the 3 that remained loyal to Aerys, 1 was Dorne, still bitter about the deaths of Elia Martell and her children. 1 was the Reach, rich but uncertain. And 1 was the Crownlands themselves, the heart of Targaryen power, but not enough to turn the tide alone. The Iron Bank watched all of this. Its agents in Westeros sent reports. Its envoys analysed the numbers, and the numbers told a story. Robert was the better investment. Robert would win, and when Robert won, he would need gold to rebuild, to secure his new throne, to reward his allies and buy the loyalty of former enemies. A new king is always desperate for gold, and a desperate king is a profitable customer. So the Iron Bank began to lend, not openly, not with grand announcements. The Iron Bank does not work that way. Instead, quiet loans, discreet arrangements, gold flowing through merchants and trading companies, through middlemen who couldn't be traced directly back to Braavos. The appearance of neutrality maintained, while the reality was something else entirely. The Iron Bank was backing Robert, carefully, cautiously, but backing him nonetheless. This gold helped Robert in ways that are hard to measure precisely. It bought food when supplies ran low. It paid sellswords to join his cause. It kept his armies in the field when they might otherwise have had to disperse for lack of provisions. Wars are not won by courage alone. They are won by logistics, by supply lines, by having enough gold to keep your men fed and armed and moving. Robert had that gold, and much of it came from across the narrow sea. Jon Arryn, serving as one of Robert's chief advisors during the rebellion, understood this better than most. Jon Arryn was old, experienced. He had ruled the Vale for decades and knew how to manage wealth. He knew that every loan taken now would have to be repaid later. He knew that the Iron Bank's gold came with strings attached. But he also knew that without that gold, the rebellion might fail. Might collapse before it could achieve victory. Sometimes you borrow, because you have no choice, because the alternative is worse than the debt. The arrangement was simple. The loans would be personal at first, loans to individual lords, to Robert himself. Not official crown debts, because Robert was not yet king. But everyone understood what these loans meant. Everyone knew that if Robert won, these debts would become the responsibility of the Iron Throne, would become the burden of the new regime. The Iron Bank was investing in Robert's future, and Robert would have to honour that investment when he sat on the throne he was fighting for. Other sources of gold flowed to Robert as well, merchants who saw opportunity in a change of regime, lords who had wealth stored away and saw a chance to earn favour with a future king. Even some from the free cities who had their own reasons to prefer Robert over Aerys. The Targaryens had always been tied to their Valyrian heritage, had always looked east with a certain arrogance, a certain assumption of superiority. Robert was different. Robert was a warrior of the first men's blood, a man who valued strength over ancient lineage. Some in Essos thought they could work with such a man, could profit from such a man. But the Iron Bank's contribution was the largest, the most significant, and the most carefully calculated. When the rebellion ended, when Robert smashed Rhaegar's rubies into the trident and Jaime Lannister cut down the Mad King in his own throne room, the Iron Bank's investment had paid off. Robert was king. The Targaryens were gone, dead, or fled across the sea. And the new regime owed the Iron Bank a considerable sum. Robert's first years as king were chaotic. He had won the throne through conquest, but now he had to rule, had to bring the realm together, had to reconcile former enemies and reward loyal friends, had to deal with the Greyjoy rebellion when Balon Greyjoy rose up, thinking the new king was weak. And through all of this, he had to manage the crown's finances, had to deal with the debts he had inherited and the new debts he had created. Jon Arryn became Hand of the King. It was a logical choice. Jon had been one of the rebellion's leaders, had raised the veil for Robert, had served as a father figure to both Robert and Ned Stark. He was wise, experienced, trusted, and he understood numbers in a way that Robert never would. Robert was a warrior, a man of action and appetite. He loved wine and women and tournaments and hunts. He had no patience for ledgers and accounts, no interest in the daily grinding work of managing a kingdom's wealth. So Jon Arryn took on that burden, and one of his first tasks was dealing with the Iron Bank. The debts from the rebellion had to be addressed, had to be acknowledged officially, had to be structured in a way that the crown could actually pay them back. This was delicate work. The Iron Bank expected its due, but the crown could not simply empty its treasury to satisfy one creditor. There were other debts, other obligations. The realm had been through a war. People needed to be fed. Castles needed to be repaired. The king's authority needed to be established and maintained. Jon Arryn negotiated terms, payment schedules, interest rates. The Iron Bank was willing to be reasonable, to a point. The bank understood that a bankrupt king was useless, that you could not squeeze blood from a stone. Better to have a king who paid slowly but reliably than to demand everything at once and get nothing. So agreements were reached. The crown would pay, not all at once, not even quickly, but it would pay. A portion each year, drawn from the taxes, from the crown's income, steady, reliable, predictable. And for a time this worked. The realm settled. Robert's rule became secure. The treasury had income from the crownlands, from taxes on trade, from the usual sources that funded the Iron Throne. Jon Arryn managed these funds carefully, made sure the payments to the Iron Bank were made sure the debt was being slowly reduced. The relationship between the Iron Throne and the Iron Bank was professional, distant but functional. The bank had its gold flowing back, slowly but surely. The Crown maintained its ability to borrow if needed in the future. Everyone was satisfied. But this stability would not last, because Jon Arryn was managing a king who did not want to be managed, a king whose appetites were vast and whose patience for fiscal restraint was non-existent. Robert Baratheon had won his throne with a warhammer, but ruling required different weapons, required discipline and restraint and careful planning, required saying no to yourself, again and again, day after day. And Robert Baratheon was not a man who said no to himself. The seeds of future catastrophe were already planted. The debt to the Iron Bank would be repaid during Jon Arryn's careful stewardship. But new debts would arise, larger debts, more dangerous debts. And the Iron Bank would watch and calculate and wait, because the Iron Bank always watches, always calculates, always waits for the moment when a king oversteps, when a throne becomes unstable, when an investment turns sour and must be written off. That moment was coming, closer with every passing year, closer with every tournament Robert threw, and every feast he hosted, and every indulgence he permitted himself. The Iron Bank could see it in the numbers, could see the trajectory, could see where this was heading. And when that moment came, when Robert's regime collapsed under the weight of its own excess, the Iron Bank would be ready, ready to collect what it was owed, ready to back new players, ready to ensure that no matter who sat the Iron Throne, no matter how the realm tore itself apart, one thing remained constant, one truth that could not be denied, one certainty in an uncertain world. The Iron Bank will have its due. The war was over. Robert sat the Iron Throne. The realm was at peace. And Jon Arryn, Hand of the King, worked tirelessly to keep it that way. He managed the small council. He settled disputes between lords. He kept the king from making too many foolish decisions. And most importantly, he watched the crown's gold. Every copper that came in, every dragon that went out. He knew that kingdoms do not fall to invasions alone. They fall when their treasuries run dry, when they cannot pay their debts, when the gold stops flowing. For the first few years of Robert's reign, Jon Arryn succeeded. The debts from the rebellion were being paid down. The treasury was being restored. Trade was recovering after the chaos of war. Ships moved freely between the ports. Merchants paid their taxes. The crown's income was steady and predictable. Robert still spent more than Jon would have liked, still threw tourneys and feasts, still indulged his appetites. But it was manageable. Jon could work with it, could keep the numbers balanced, barely. Then came the Greyjoy rebellion. Balon Greyjoy, Lord of the Iron Islands, declared himself King of the Iron Islands and the North. It was madness, pure madness. Robert had just won a war against the Targaryens, had united the realm under his rule. The idea that some minor lord on a collection of rocky islands could challenge him was absurd. But Balon did it anyway. And absurd or not, it meant war. It meant raising armies and building ships and marching soldiers across the realm. It meant gold. The Greyjoy rebellion was shorter than Robert's rebellion, lasted less than a year. But it still cost a fortune. Ships had to be built or bought. Armies had to be fed. Soldiers had to be paid. And when it was over, when Balon bent the knee and gave up his crown and surrendered his last surviving son as a hostage, the crown's treasury was lighter. Not empty, but lighter. Jon Arryn had managed to fund the war without taking on massive new debts, but it had required careful juggling, required delaying some payments, required drawing on reserves. The margin for error was getting thinner. Robert seemed not to notice, or not to care. The rebellion was crushed. His authority was proven. That was all that mattered to him. He went back to his pleasures, his hunts, his wine, his women. He had done his part, had been the warrior king when the realm needed him. Now he wanted to enjoy the rewards of victory, and who could tell him no? He was the king. Jon Arryn could tell him no, did tell him no as often as he dared. But there are limits to what even a hand of the king can do. Robert was not a cruel man, not a madman like Aerys, but he was stubborn, willful. When he wanted something, he wanted it now. And he had an unfortunate talent for surrounding himself with people who encouraged his worst impulses rather than restraining them. Chief among these was Petyr Baelish, Littlefinger, a minor lord from a minor house, elevated far beyond his birth by his cleverness and his charm. He had been master of customs at Gulltown, a position he gained through Jon Arryn's patronage. He had proven skilled at increasing revenues, at finding new sources of income, at making the numbers look better than they were. So when the position of Master of Coin opened, Jon Arryn recommended him, thought he was appointing a capable administrator, a man who understood trade and taxation, a man who could help manage the crown's wealth. He was right about Littlefinger's capabilities, wrong about everything else. Petyr Baelish became Master of Coin in 290 AC, and from that moment the crown's finances began their slow spiral into catastrophe. Not immediately, not obviously. Littlefinger was too clever for that. He did not loot the treasury overnight, did not make dramatic blunders that would get him removed from office. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He made it easy to spend, made it seem like there was always more gold, always another source of revenue, always another way to pay for whatever Robert wanted. The technique was simple. Borrow. Borrow constantly. Borrow from everyone. And use the borrowed gold to cover the gaps between what the crown earned and what the crown spent. When Robert wanted a grand tournament, Littlefinger found the gold. When Robert wanted a new fleet of ships, Littlefinger found the gold. When Robert wanted to throw a feast that lasted a week, Littlefinger found the gold. He never said no, never told the king that the treasury could not afford it. He just smiled and made it happen. And where did this gold come from? From debt. Mountains of debt. Debt to the Lannisters. Debt to the Tyrells. Debt to the Faith of the Seven. And most significantly, debt to the Iron Bank of Braavos. The Lannisters were the richest house in Westeros. Their gold mines in the Westerlands had been producing for generations. They had so much gold that they could lend to kings and barely notice the loss. And Cersei Lannister was Robert's queen. Her father, Tywin Lannister, was the most powerful lord in the realm. It made a certain sense to borrow from them. It kept the gold in Westeros. It strengthened the bond between the crown and the Westerlands. Or so the reasoning went. But every loan from the Lannisters gave them more influence, more leverage, more ability to shape the crown's decisions. Tywin Lannister was not a man who gave anything for free. Every dragon he lent was an investment in his family's power. a way to bind the crown closer to Casterly Rock, to make sure that when decisions were made, Lannister interests were considered first. The Tyrells were almost as rich. The Reach was the breadbasket of Westeros. Its fields produced more grain than any other kingdom. Its ports were busy with trade. The Tyrells had gold to spare, and they were happy to lend it to the crown, for a price, for influence, for the same reasons the Lannisters lent. Every great house that held the crown's debt held a piece of the crown's power. The Faith of the Seven had its own wealth, centuries of tithes and donations, land and castles granted by pious kings. The Faith did not lend for profit the way the great houses did, but it still lent, still expected repayment, still gained influence through the crown's dependence on its gold. And the Faith had its own agenda, its own vision for how the realm should be ruled. Every debt to the Faith was a step toward that vision. But the largest creditor, the most patient and the most dangerous, was the Iron Bank of Braavos. Littlefinger went to the Iron Bank again and again, negotiated new loans, larger loans. The bank was willing to lend because the crown was still paying. The old debts from Robert's rebellion had been settled. The crown had proven it could be trusted. So why not lend more? Why not profit from a king who seemed to have an endless appetite for gold and no interest in restraint? The Iron Bank's loans came with interest, of course. Nothing excessive. Nothing that would cripple the crown immediately. But interest that accumulated, that compounded, that turned 100,000 dragons borrowed into 110,000 owed, then 120,000, then more. The numbers grew slowly, but relentlessly, and the crown kept borrowing, kept taking on more debt to pay the interest on the old debt, kept digging the hole deeper. Jon Arryn saw what was happening, tried to stop it, tried to make Robert understand that this could not continue, that eventually the debts would come due, that eventually the crown would not be able to pay. But Robert did not want to hear it, did not want to think about numbers and ledgers and distant consequences. He wanted to enjoy being king, wanted to live like a king should live, with feasts and tournaments and grand gestures, with generosity to his friends and displays of power to his enemies. And Littlefinger kept telling him he could afford it, kept finding the gold, kept making it possible. So Robert ignored Jon Arryn's warnings, and Littlefinger kept borrowing, and the debt kept growing. By 298 AC, near the end of Robert's reign, the crown's debt had reached staggering levels. The exact number was known only to Littlefinger, who kept the books. But estimates placed it at over 6 million gold dragons. 6 million. A sum so vast that it was hard to comprehend. The annual income of the crown was perhaps 3 million dragons in a good year. Maybe 4 million if the harvests were good and trade was strong. That meant the crown owed nearly twice what it earned in a year. Owed more than it could possibly pay back without drastic measures. 3 million of that debt was owed to the Lannisters. House Lannister had become the crown's primary creditor. Every major expense, Littlefinger went to Casterly Rock, and Tywin Lannister, through his representatives, kept lending, kept binding the crown closer to his house. 3 million dragons, a fortune beyond imagining for most houses. For the Lannisters, it was an investment, a way to ensure their family's dominance for generations. Another large portion was owed to the Faith. Hundreds of thousands of dragons borrowed over the years. The High Septon and his Septons might preach about usury and the sins of excess, but they still expected their gold returned, still kept careful records of what was owed, still counted every copper. The Tyrells held significant debts as well, not as much as the Lannisters, but enough to matter. Enough to give them leverage. Enough to make sure their voice was heard when decisions affecting the Reach were made. And the Iron Bank. The Iron Bank held over 1 million dragons in debt. Possibly more. The exact amount was unclear, because Littlefinger's records were deliberately vague in places. But the Iron Bank knew. The Iron Bank always knew. Every contract, every loan, every payment made or missed. The Iron Bank's records were perfect, absolute, unchangeable. This mountain of debt was sustainable only as long as the Crown kept paying, as long as the interest was met, as long as creditors believed that eventually, someday, the principal would be repaid. It was a fragile balance, a house of cards built on confidence and credit. And it required one crucial element: stability. As long as Robert sat the throne and the realm was at peace, the creditors would be patient, would continue to lend, would allow the debt to grow because they believed it would eventually be repaid. But what happens when that stability cracks? What happens when a king dies and succession is disputed? What happens when civil war breaks out and the realm tears itself apart? What happens when the confidence evaporates and the creditors start demanding payment? Jon Arryn died in 298 AC, suddenly, unexpectedly. The man who had held the realm together for 15 years. The man who had managed the impossible task of keeping Robert's excesses from destroying the kingdom. The man who understood the danger of the debt and tried, in his quiet way, to control it. Dead. And with him died any hope of bringing the Crown's finances under control. Robert appointed Ned Stark as the new hand. Ned was honourable, loyal, brave, everything a hand should be in terms of character. But he knew nothing about managing a kingdom's wealth. Had no experience with the complexities of crown finance, no understanding of how deep the hole had been dug. He came to King's Landing expecting to help his friend rule, to provide counsel and support. He had no idea he was stepping into a financial catastrophe. Littlefinger remained as master of coin, kept his secrets, kept his ledgers, kept smiling and assuring everyone that everything was fine. The gold would keep flowing. The debts would be managed. Nothing to worry about. And for a few more months, the illusion held. The system kept functioning through sheer momentum, through the assumption that tomorrow would be like today, that the realm would remain stable and the gold would keep flowing, and the debts would somehow, someday, be paid. Then Robert died, gored by a boar during a hunt, killed by an accident that was perhaps not entirely an accident. And everything that Jon Arryn had feared, everything that he had worked for 15 years to prevent, came crashing down at once. The realm exploded into civil war. 5 kings rose to claim the throne, and the Crown's creditors, watching their investment collapse, began to demand payment. The golden age of debt was over. The age of reckoning had begun. And the Iron Bank, patient and calculating as always, prepared to do what it always did when a debtor proved unreliable. It would have its due, one way or another, no matter how many kings had to fall, no matter how much blood had to be spilled. The debt would be paid, the account would balance, because the Iron Bank will have its due. Always. Robert Baratheon died in 299 AC, the boar's tusk had done what no warrior could do, had ended the king who won his crown with a war hammer. And in the chaos that followed, the realm learned a hard truth. Debt does not care about succession. Debt does not wait for new kings to settle in. Debt demands payment, regardless of who sits the throne or whether anyone sits it at all. Joffrey Baratheon was crowned king, a boy of 13 with his mother's cruelty and none of his supposed father's strength. Cersei Lannister stood behind him, whispering in his ear, managing his rage, trying to hold on to power through her son. The small council remained mostly intact. Littlefinger still served as master of coin. The machinery of government still turned. On the surface, everything looked stable. One king had died. Another had been crowned. The realm would adjust and move on. But the realm did not move on, because Ned Stark, in his final days as Hand, had discovered the truth. Joffrey was not Robert's son. Joffrey was the product of incest between Cersei and her twin brother Jaime. The boy on the throne had no claim, no right, no Baratheon blood at all. Ned had tried to handle this revelation carefully, had tried to ensure a smooth transition, had failed, and paid for that failure with his head. When Joffrey ordered Ned Stark executed, when Elyn Payne's sword took the head of the Lord of Winterfell, the realm exploded. Robb Stark, Ned's son, was declared king in the north. The northern lords and the river lords bent the knee to him, proclaiming independence from the Iron Throne. Renly Baratheon, Robert's youngest brother, declared himself king with the backing of the Reach and the Stormlands. Stannis Baratheon, Robert's older brother and rightful heir, declared himself the true king from Dragonstone. And across the sea, the Greyjoys saw opportunity in chaos. Balon Greyjoy declared himself king of the Iron Islands once more and launched raids on the north. 5 kings, 5 armies, the realm at war with itself. And in King's Landing, a boy sat the Iron Throne with a crown too heavy for his head, and debts too large for any kingdom to bear. The crown's creditors watched all of this with growing alarm. 6 million gold dragons in debt. That number had seemed manageable when Robert lived, when the realm was at peace, when taxes flowed in from all 7 kingdoms. But now the North was in open rebellion. The Riverlands were a battlefield. The Reach and the Stormlands had declared for Renly. Only the Westerlands, the Crownlands, and an uneasy alliance with the Tyrells after Renly's death kept Joffrey's regime alive. The Crown's income had been cut by more than half, maybe 2/3, and the expenses had multiplied. War is expensive. War against multiple enemies at once is ruinous. The Lannisters were owed 3 million gold dragons, but the Lannisters also had Cersei as queen and Tywin as the real power behind the throne. They could not demand immediate payment without destroying their own family's position. If Joffrey's regime collapsed, the Lannister investment collapsed with it. So, Tywin did the only thing that made sense. He threw more gold at the problem, funded Joffrey's armies, paid for the wars, not out of generosity, but out of necessity. The only way to get repaid was to keep Joffrey on the throne, to win the wars, to restore the realm to stability. Then, maybe, the debt could be addressed. The Faith held hundreds of thousands in debt. The High Septon sent careful letters to the Crown, reminders that debts were owed, suggestions that perhaps some payment could be made, even in these troubled times. But the Faith was based in Old Town, in the Reach, which had declared for Renly. The Faith's position was complicated, dangerous. It couldn't push too hard without risking accusations of disloyalty. could not demand payment from a king fighting for his throne. So it waited, prayed, hoped that the gods would sort things out, and the debt would someday be honoured. The Tyrells had supported Renly. When Renly died, they switched to Joffrey, sealing the alliance with a marriage between Joffrey and Margaery Tyrell. This gave them leverage, gave them influence. They could afford to be patient with their debts because they now had a path to real power. If Margaery became queen, if she bore Joffrey a son, then the Tyrells would be family to the throne, would have more than just debt as their connection to the crown. So they too waited, played the long game, supported Joffrey's wars, and worried about repayment later. But the Iron Bank was different. The Iron Bank had no family ties to protect, no political position to maintain, no reason to care whether Joffrey or Stannis or Robb Stark sat the Iron Throne. The Iron Bank cared only about its gold, about the 1,000,000+ dragons it was owed, and the Iron Bank could see as clearly as anyone that this debt was in serious danger of never being repaid. In 299 AC, shortly after the war began, the Iron Bank sent an envoy to King's Landing, a man in dark robes with perfect records and a calm voice. He came before the small council, presented his ledgers, showed exactly what was owed, and politely requested that the crown begin making larger payments, not full repayment. The Iron Bank was not unreasonable, but larger payments. Proof that the crown took its obligations seriously. Proof that the debt would not simply be forgotten in the chaos of war. Cersei Lannister was present at that meeting. She listened to the envoy, looked at the numbers, and made a decision that would prove catastrophic. She refused, told the envoy that the crown was fighting a war, that every copper was needed for soldiers and ships and supplies, that the Iron Bank would have to wait like everyone else, that when the wars were won, when Joffrey's throne was secure, then the debts would be addressed. But not now, not when survival was at stake. The envoy did not argue, did not raise his voice, did not make threats. He simply nodded, made a note in his ledger, and left. Returned to Braavos, returned to the Iron Bank, and reported that the Iron Throne had refused payment, had broken the terms of the loan, had proven itself unreliable. This was a mistake, a terrible mistake, perhaps the worst financial decision of Cersei's regency, because the Iron Bank does not forget, does not forgive, and does not allow debts to go unpaid. The Iron Bank's response was methodical, cold, precise. First, it called in all outstanding debts from the crown, demanded immediate full payment, not just the interest, not just a portion, everything, every dragon owed. The crown, of course, could not pay, did not have 1,000,000 gold dragons sitting in the treasury, barely had enough to keep the armies fed through the next month. So the crown defaulted, officially, completely. The debt remained on the books, but the crown had admitted it could not pay. Second, the Iron Bank closed its doors to any future loans. If the crown came begging for more gold, the answer would be no. No new loans, no extensions, no mercy. The Iron Throne was now a bad risk, a defaulted debtor, and the Iron Bank did not lend to those who refused to honour their obligations. Third, and most importantly, the Iron Bank began looking for alternative investments. If Joffrey would not pay, perhaps someone else would. Perhaps one of the other kings, one of the other claimants to the throne. Someone who would understand that the Iron Bank's support came with a price, that the gold the bank provided would need to be repaid, but who would also understand that the Iron Bank's gold could win wars, could turn the tide, could make the difference between a throne gained and a throne lost. The obvious candidate was Stannis Baratheon. Stannis was Robert's brother, his rightful heir under the laws of succession. He had the best legal claim to the throne. He also had the smallest army, the fewest resources, the weakest position among all the claimants. Renly had died, but Renly's bannermen had mostly gone to the Tyrells, who then allied with the Joffrey. Robb Stark held the north and the Riverlands, but wanted independence, not the Iron Throne. Balon Greyjoy wanted the Iron Islands and cared nothing for southern politics. Stannis wanted the throne, believed it was his by right. But he had little gold, few men, one castle on Dragonstone and a handful of loyal lords. He had won the Battle of the Blackwater, taken King's Landing briefly, but been driven back. His position was desperate. He needed help, needed gold, needed anything that could give him an edge. The Iron Bank sent an envoy to Dragonstone, not immediately, not in a rush. The bank does not rush. It waits. It watches. It lets desperate men become more desperate. Lets them understand how badly they need help. Then it offers that help, on its own terms. The envoy who came to Stannis was Tycho Nestoris. A thin man with a neat beard and dark robes, he carried ledgers, records, proof of the crown's debt and the crown's refusal to pay. He explained the situation to Stannis. Explained that the Iron Bank was owed a fortune by the boy who called himself king in King's Landing. Explained that the Iron Bank did not care about bloodlines or legal claims. But it did care about reliability, about finding a king who would honour his debts. Stannis understood immediately. This was not charity. This was business. The Iron Bank would lend him gold, would give him the means to hire sellswords, to buy ships, to wage war against Joffrey and the Lannisters. And in return, when Stannis took the throne, his first act would be to honour the crown's debts, to pay the Iron Bank what it was owed, to prove that he was a man who kept his word. It was a simple arrangement, elegant in its clarity. The Iron Bank would invest in Stannis, would bet that he could win, and if he won, the bank would be repaid, not just the old debt from Robert and Joffrey, but the new debt, the loan to Stannis himself, all of it with interest. The Iron Bank would profit from the chaos, would turn the War of the Five Kings into an opportunity rather than a disaster. And if Stannis lost, if he died, or was defeated, or proven unable to take the throne, then the Iron Bank would find someone else, would back another claimant, would keep searching until it found a king who could and would pay. The bank was patient, the bank was ruthless, and the bank would have its due. The loan was negotiated, terms were set, gold was transferred. Not all at once. The Iron Bank was careful. It gave Stannis enough to make a difference. Enough to hire sellswords from across the narrow sea. Enough to keep his men fed and his ships sailing. But not so much that Stannis could squander it. Not so much that he could waste it on foolish gestures or hopeless battles. The gold came in stages. As Stannis proved, he could use it effectively. As he showed, he was worth the investment. Stannis used the gold well. He was not Robert, did not throw feasts or tourneys, did not waste a single copper on pleasure or display. Every dragon went to the war effort, to sellswords and ships and supplies. He was fighting not just Joffrey now, but the Boltons in the north after they betrayed Robb Stark, fighting on multiple fronts, desperate, determined, grinding forward through sheer force of will. The Iron Bank watched, calculated, adjusted its strategy. If Stannis proved successful, excellent. If not, there were other options. There were always other options. Across the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen was gathering strength. Dragons had returned to the world. The last Targaryen was building an army. Perhaps she would be the bank's next investment. Perhaps she would be the one to take the throne and honor the debts. Or perhaps someone else entirely. Someone not yet visible. The bank did not need to know who would win. It just needed to make sure that whoever won would pay. Meanwhile, in King's Landing, Cersei's decision to refuse the Iron Bank festered. The Crown's financial situation grew worse by the day. The wars dragged on. The treasury emptied. Littlefinger, who might have managed the crisis, was gone, sent to the Vale to secure that region. The new master of coin was less skilled, less capable of juggling the impossible numbers. The Crown borrowed more from the Lannisters, from the Tyrells, from anyone who would lend. The debt grew even as the ability to repay it shrank. And through it all, the Iron Bank remained calm, patient. It had made its decision, had backed Stannis, had written off Joffrey as a bad investment, and now it simply waited for the outcome, for the wars to resolve themselves, for a winner to emerge, for the day when it could present its ledgers to whoever sat the Iron Throne and say those 6 simple words. The Iron Bank will have its due, because it would. It always would. Kings might die, dynasties might fall, realms might tear themselves apart in civil war, but the debt remained. The numbers did not change, and the Iron Bank would collect, one way or another. From Stannis, or from whoever came after him, from Joffrey's corpse, or from his successor. It did not matter. The debt would be paid. That was the only certainty in the War of the Five Kings, the only truth that endured no matter how the battles turned. The Iron Bank would have its due. The Iron Bank does not wage war with swords. It does not raise banners or march armies across continents. Its power is quieter than that, more subtle, more insidious. The Iron Bank wages war with ledgers and loans, with carefully placed envoys who appear at the right moment with the right offer, with knowledge gathered from 1,000 sources across 2 continents, with patience that outlasts kings and kingdoms. This is shadow diplomacy, the art of shaping the world without ever appearing to hold a weapon. Tycho Nestoris was a master of this art. He was not the first envoy the Iron Bank sent to Westeros during the War of the Five Kings, but he was the most important, the most persistent, the most successful. When he arrived at Dragonstone to treat with Stannis Baratheon, he did not come as a supplicant begging for favour. He came as an equal, as a representative of an institution that had weathered centuries while kingdoms rose and fell. He spoke softly, smiled rarely, and made it clear that the Iron Bank was not offering charity. It was offering an opportunity. Take it or leave it. The choice was Stannis's. Stannis took it, had no real choice but to take it. His position was desperate. His army was small. His allies were few. He had lost the Battle of the Blackwater, lost his fleet, lost thousands of men. He had retreated to Dragonstone with the remnants of his forces and sat there, brooding, planning, searching for any way forward. When Tycho Nestoris appeared with the promise of gold, it must have seemed like a miracle, or a trap. Stannis was too intelligent not to see the strings attached, but he was also too practical to refuse. The negotiations were brief. Stannis was not a man for long discussions or elaborate courtesies. Tycho appreciated this. appreciated dealing with someone who understood numbers and obligations, who did not waste time with empty promises or grand speeches. The terms were simple. The Iron Bank would provide Stannis with enough gold to hire sellswords and buy supplies. In return, when Stannis took the Iron Throne, he would honour all debts owed by the crown. Not just the money lent to him personally, but the entire mountain of debt accumulated during Robert's reign and Joffrey's, the 1,000,000+ dragons owed to the Iron Bank, the interest that had accumulated, all of it, Stannis would pay. And Stannis agreed, because Stannis Baratheon, for all his faults, was a man who understood duty, who believed in paying debts, who would not break an oath or dishonour an agreement. This made him predictable. And predictability was something the Iron Bank valued highly. A king who keeps his word is a king you can work with, a king you can trust. Not trust in the sense of friendship or loyalty, but trust in the sense of contractual reliability. Trust that when he promises payment, payment will come. The gold flowed. Not all at once. The Iron Bank was careful. It released funds in stages, watched how Stannis used them, made sure he was not squandering the investment. Stannis hired sellswords from across the narrow sea. The Golden Company was too expensive and too committed to the Blackfire cause to be bought. But there were other companies, smaller ones, hungrier ones, companies that would fight for anyone who paid. Stannis filled his ranks with these men, hardened fighters who cared nothing for his claim or his cause. They fought for gold, and the Iron Bank's gold made them Stannis' soldiers. Stannis also used the gold to buy ships, to repair his fleet, to hire captains and crews, to ensure he could move his forces where they were needed. Sea power mattered in Westeros. The coastline was long, the rivers were vital. An army without ships was an army trapped. An army with ships could strike anywhere, could move faster than enemies could react, could supply itself even when surrounded. The Iron Bank understood this, understood that gold spent on ships was gold well spent. But the Iron Bank did more than just lend to Stannis. It gathered information. This was perhaps the bank's greatest advantage, its network of contacts, its web of informants and agents spread across the known world. Everywhere the Iron Bank did business, it learned things. Merchants talked, captains gossiped, clerks saw documents. And all of that information flowed back to Braavos, back to the vaults beneath the Iron Bank, where men in dark robes compiled reports and analysed patterns and built pictures of what was happening across 2 continents. The Iron Bank knew things that kings did not, knew the state of harvests in the Reach before the lords there knew which sellsword companies were looking for work and which were already committed, knew which merchants were struggling and which were thriving, knew the price of grain in Pentos and the cost of Myrish lace and the going rate for Dothraki slaves. All of this information was power, power that could be used, power that could be sold, power that could shape decisions and outcomes. When Tycho Nestoris treated with Stannis, he brought more than gold. He brought knowledge. He told Stannis things. Not everything the bank knew, but enough to be useful, enough to show that the Iron Bank was a valuable ally beyond its financial resources. He told Stannis about movements in Essos, about other claimants and their plans, about opportunities and threats that Stannis might not have known otherwise. This was part of the investment, part of ensuring that Stannis succeeded, because a client who wins is a client who can pay. But Tycho Nestoris did not stay at Dragonstone. He moved, travelled, went where the bank's interests required. Because Stannis was not the Iron Bank's only concern. In Westeros, the bank had interests everywhere, had debts to collect, had investments to protect, had opportunities to explore. Tycho was the bank's eyes and ears, its voice, its representative in a realm tearing itself apart. He went north, all the way to the Wall, to Castle Black, to the very edge of the world, where the Night's Watch stood guard against the darkness beyond. This might seem strange. What business did the Iron Bank have at the Wall? What interest could it possibly have in a military order dedicated to defending against wildlings and worse? The answer was Jon Snow, the new Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, a bastard, a young man with no lands or gold or titles, but also a man in desperate need. The Night's Watch was dying, its numbers were depleted, its castles were falling to ruin, its supplies were dangerously low. Winter was coming, and the Watch was not ready. Jon Snow needed everything, needed men, needed food, needed weapons and tools and materials to repair the Wall and its fortifications, and he had no way to pay for any of it. This was exactly the kind of situation the Iron Bank looked for. Desperate need, no alternatives. A client who had no choice but to accept whatever terms were offered. But there was more to it than simple exploitation. The Iron Bank had heard things, rumours from the north, stories about what was happening beyond the Wall, dead things walking, an ancient enemy stirring, wildlings fleeing south in terror. Most in Westeros dismissed these as superstition, peasant fears and old wives' tales. But the Iron Bank did not dismiss anything. It investigated, it analysed, it considered possibilities. What if the rumours were true? What if there really was something terrible beyond the Wall? What if the Night's Watch was all that stood between civilization and destruction? Then the Watch's survival was not just a charitable concern, it was a practical one. Because if the Watch fell, if the Wall was breached, if the North was overrun, then the entire realm would descend into even greater chaos. And chaos was bad for business, bad for trade, bad for collecting debts. The Iron Bank had no interest in seeing Westeros destroyed. It had too much invested there. So Tycho Nestoris went to Castle Black, met with Jon Snow, listened to his needs, examined his situation, and made an offer. The Iron Bank would lend the Night's Watch gold, not a huge amount. The Watch could not pay back huge amounts, but enough to make a difference. Enough to buy food and hire builders and purchase weapons. Enough to help the Watch survive the coming winter. Jon Snow was suspicious at first, rightfully so. He knew the Iron Bank's reputation, knew that it did not lend out of kindness. But he also knew he had no other options. The lords of Westeros were fighting their own wars, had no resources to spare for the Watch. The crown, whichever crown that might be, had forgotten the Wall existed. The Watch was on its own. So Jon negotiated, asked for terms, wanted to know what the bank expected in return. The terms were surprisingly reasonable. The Night's Watch would repay the loan over time, modest payments drawn from whatever resources the Watch could muster, timber from the haunted forest, furs and pelts, whatever the Watch could produce or acquire. The bank did not expect full repayment quickly, did not demand interest rates that would cripple the order. It simply wanted the debt acknowledged, wanted the relationship established, wanted the Night's Watch to understand that the Iron Bank was now its creditor, its partner, its ally in a sense. Jon Snow accepted, had to accept. The gold arrived, came by ship to Eastwatch by the Sea, was transported to Castle Black and the other manned castles along the wall. Jon used it well. Bought food from White Harbour and other ports, hired builders to repair Castle Black's crumbling towers, purchased weapons and armour to equip his men, brought wildlings south of the wall and used the gold to help settle them in the Gift. Did everything he could to prepare the Watch for what was coming. And Tycho watched, reported back to Braavos, told the Iron Bank that Jon Snow was competent, serious, not a man who would waste gold or break his word. The investment was sound, the relationship was worth maintaining. If the Watch survived, if it held the wall, if it proved as important as the old stories claimed, then the Iron Bank would have an ally at the edge of the world, would have influence in a place where few others had even thought to look. This was shadow diplomacy in action. The Iron Bank did not announce its loan to the Night's Watch, did not publicize its involvement. Most people in Westeros had no idea the bank was even there. But the bank was there, quietly, patiently, building relationships, creating debts, establishing positions, preparing for whatever came next. The same pattern played out elsewhere. The Iron Bank had agents in King's Landing, in Old Town, in White Harbour and Gulltown and Lannisport. Anywhere there was trade, there were people who owed the bank favours, who passed along information, who watched and listened and reported. The bank did not need spies in the traditional sense. It had something better. It had people who depended on it. Merchants who needed loans to keep their businesses running. Ship captains who borrowed to outfit their vessels. Even minor lords who had taken out personal loans for one reason or another. All of them knew that the Iron Bank remembered, that someday the bank might ask for something in return. Not gold, not immediately, but a favour, information, access, something small that would cost them little, but benefit the bank greatly. This network gave the Iron Bank eyes and ears everywhere. Let it track movements of armies and fleets. Let it know which houses were struggling financially and which were thriving. Let it predict where the wars would turn next. Let it stay ahead of events, rather than simply reacting to them. This was power, real power, the kind that lasted longer than any sword. And through all of this, Tycho moved like a shadow, appearing where he was needed, negotiating, observing, reporting. He was not the only Iron Bank envoy in Westeros, but he was the most visible, the one who dealt with the highest level clients, the one who carried the most authority. When he spoke for the entire institution. When he made an offer, it was binding. When he made a promise, it would be kept. And when he made a threat, however politely phrased, it would be carried out. The lords of Westeros were beginning to understand this, beginning to see that the Iron Bank was not just another creditor, not just a source of gold when times were desperate. It was a player, a force, an institution that shaped events across the known world, that could make or break kings, that could turn the tide of wars with a single decision about where to send its gold. They had ignored the Iron Bank for too long, had thought it distant and irrelevant, had believed that debt to foreign bankers was somehow less serious than debt to other lords or the faith. They were learning otherwise, learning that the Iron Bank did not forget, did not forgive, and did not lose. When the bank made an investment, it made sure that investment paid off. One way or another. through the success of its chosen clients or the destruction of its enemies, through careful diplomacy or ruthless collection, through whatever means necessary. The goal was always the same. The debt would be paid, the account would balance, the Iron Bank would have its due. And as the wars continued, as kings rose and fell, as the realm bled and burned, the Iron Bank remained, constant, patient, inevitable, watching from across the narrow sea, waiting for the chaos to settle, waiting for a clear winner to emerge, waiting to present its ledgers and collect what it was owed. Because that was what the Iron Bank did. That was what it had always done. That was what it would always do, no matter how long it took, no matter what obstacles appeared. The Iron Bank would have its due. Cersei Lannister became Queen Regent after Joffrey's death. Her son Tommen sat the Iron Throne now, a boy even younger and more malleable than Joffrey had been. She thought this would give her more control, more power, more ability to shape the realm according to her will. She was wrong, because with Joffrey's death came a reckoning, not the swift kind, not the dramatic kind, but the slow, grinding reckoning of debts that could no longer be ignored. The crown owed 6 million gold dragons, perhaps more. The exact number was unclear because the records had been kept by Littlefinger, and Littlefinger was gone, fled to the Vale after helping to orchestrate Joffrey's murder. The new Master of Coin was less skilled, less capable of making the numbers work through clever accounting and creative borrowing. The treasury was nearly empty. The wars had drained it. The Lannisters had poured their own gold into keeping Joffrey's regime alive, but even Lannister gold had limits. Even Casterly Rock's mines could not fund an endless war. Cersei looked at the ledgers and saw disaster, saw debts to the Lannisters that couldn't be called in because they were debts to her own family, saw debts to the Tyrells that couldn't be demanded because the Tyrell alliance was all that kept Tommen on his throne, saw debts to the Faith that were growing more dangerous every day, and saw debts to the Iron Bank that she had foolishly refused to honour, that she had dismissed as unimportant, that were now coming back to destroy her. The Faith of the Seven had been patient, had waited through the wars, had sent polite letters reminding the crown of its obligations. But patience has limits, and the Faith's patience was running out. The High Septon who had served during Robert's reign was gone. A new High Septon had been chosen, or, rather, a different kind of High Septon, not a fat nobleman who lived in luxury and cared more about politics than prayer, but a man from the streets, a man who had walked barefoot through the realm preaching to the small folk, a man who called himself the High Sparrow. The High Sparrow was different from the High Septons who came before. He did not care about courtly games or noble alliances. He cared about the Faith, about the Seven, about justice and righteousness and the sins of the powerful. He looked at the crown's debt to the Faith and saw not just gold owed, but a moral failing. The crown had borrowed from the gods' servants and refused to pay, had taken the Faith's gold and used it for war and excess and sin. This was not just a financial matter. This was a spiritual one. Cersei, desperate for support against her enemies, both foreign and domestic, made a deal with the High Sparrow. She would restore the Faith militant, would allow the Faith to arm itself once more, would give the High Sparrow the power to enforce the gods' laws as he saw fit. In return, the High Sparrow would support her, would forgive the crown's debts to the Faith, would help her maintain control over Tommen and the realm. It was a catastrophic mistake. Perhaps the worst decision of Cersei's regency, worse even than refusing the Iron Bank's demands. Because the High Sparrow did not forgive the debt out of mercy. He forgave it because he saw a greater opportunity. The Faith now had power, had soldiers, had the ability to enforce its will. And the High Sparrow intended to use that power not to support the crown, but to purify it, to root out sin and corruption, to make the powerful bow before the gods. Cersei thought she was buying an ally. She was actually creating her own judge and jailer. Because the High Sparrow looked at the Lannisters and saw sin everywhere, saw incest, saw murder, saw the rot at the heart of the regime. And he intended to cut that rot out, no matter who it destroyed. The Faith militant began arresting people, nobles, knights, anyone accused of sin or heresy or moral failing. They dragged Margaery Tyrell from the Sept and threw her in a cell, accused her of adultery and treason. They came for Cersei herself, arrested her, imprisoned her, made her walk naked through the streets of King's Landing as punishment for her sins. The Queen Regent, the mother of the king, humiliated and broken before the entire city. The crown's debt to the Faith was forgiven, yes, but the price of that forgiveness was far higher than gold. The price was power, control, authority. The Faith now ruled King's Landing in all but name. The High Sparrow sat in judgment over nobles and royals alike. And the crown, weakened and desperate, could do nothing to stop him. Meanwhile, the other debts remained. The Lannisters couldn't demand their 3 million dragons without admitting their own weakness, without acknowledging that they had funded a regime that could not pay them back. Tywin Lannister was dead now, killed by his own son Tyrion. Kevan Lannister tried to manage the family's interests, but he was dealing with an impossible situation. The Lannister gold had bought the Lannisters the throne through Cersei and her children. But it had also trapped them. They could not abandon Tommen without losing everything they had invested, could not demand repayment without destroying their own position. The Tyrells were in a similar trap. They had married Margaery to Tommen, had invested their wealth and their armies in supporting the Lannister regime, had bet everything on becoming the power behind the throne. Now Margaery was imprisoned by the Faith. Their influence was crumbling. Their investment was turning sour. But they could not simply walk away, could not demand their money back and leave. They were committed, trapped by their own ambitions and the debts that bound them to the crown. But the Iron Bank was not trapped. The Iron Bank had no political position to protect, no family members sitting on thrones or in dungeons, no investments in Westeros beyond its loans, and its loans were not being repaid. The crown had defaulted, had refused payment, had proven itself unreliable. So the Iron Bank did what it always did when a debtor proved unworthy. It looked for alternatives. Stannis Baratheon was still alive, still fighting. He had gone north, had taken his sellswords and his borrowed gold to the wall, had helped the Night's Watch defeat the wildling army, had begun trying to rally the northern lords to his cause, to build a new base of support, to find a path back to the Iron Throne. The Iron Bank watched this carefully, watched to see if Stannis could succeed, if he could actually win, if the investment would pay off. But the Iron Bank also looked elsewhere, looked across the narrow sea to where other possibilities were emerging. Daenerys Targaryen, the last Targaryen. The girl who had been sold to a Dothraki warlord, and somehow emerged from the funeral pyre with 3 dragons. She was building power in Essos, conquering cities, freeing slaves, gathering armies. She had dragons, real dragons, living, breathing, fire-breathing dragons. The first dragons the world had seen since the Targaryen reign ended. The Iron Bank noted this. Noted that she claimed the Iron Throne, that she intended to invade Westeros, that she had resources and determination and dragons. Dragons changed everything. Dragons had built the Targaryen dynasty, had allowed them to conquer and hold Westeros for 300 years. If Daenerys came to Westeros with her dragons, she might actually win. Might take the throne from Tommen and the Lannisters and the entire current regime. And if she won, she would inherit the crown's debts, would become responsible for paying them back. Unless she refused. Unless she declared that she would not honour the debts of the usurpers. That the gold owed by Robert and Joffrey and Tommen was not her responsibility. This was possible, even likely. Daenerys was young, idealistic, surrounded by advisors who might tell her that she owed nothing to the institutions that had supported her enemies, who might encourage her to start fresh, to wipe the slate clean, to refuse payment. This was a risk the Iron Bank had to consider, had to plan for, because if Daenerys won and refused to pay, the bank would lose everything. Would lose not just the 1 million-plus dragons owed by the current crown, but any hope of future business in Westeros. Would lose its reputation for always collecting, for always getting its due. This couldn't be allowed to happen. So the Iron Bank had to make contact, had to reach out to Daenerys before she invaded, had to establish a relationship, had to make clear that the debts existed, that they would need to be addressed, that the Iron Bank expected payment regardless of who sat the Iron Throne, and ideally had to make this contact in a way that left Daenerys feeling like the bank was her ally, not her enemy, like paying the debt was in her interest, not just the bank's. This was delicate work, shadow diplomacy at its finest. The Iron Bank could not simply send an envoy to Meereen and demand payment from someone who did not yet control Westeros, could not be seen as threatening a potential queen, had to approach carefully, respectfully, with offers and opportunities rather than demands and ultimatums, had to make Daenerys see the bank as a useful partner, as a source of support and resources, as an institution that could help her achieve her goals. Whether the Iron Bank succeeded in this was unclear. Daenerys was far away, dealing with her own problems, fighting her own wars in Slava's Bay. She might not even reach Westeros for years, might never reach it at all if her enemies in Essos destroyed her first. But the Iron Bank was patient, was willing to wait, was willing to hedge its bets, to support multiple claimants if necessary, to ensure that whoever eventually won would owe the bank something. Back in Westeros, the financial situation continued to deteriorate. The crown's income had collapsed. The wars had destroyed trade. Farmers weren't growing crops because armies kept marching through their fields. Merchants were not moving goods because the roads were too dangerous. The ports were blockaded or captured or simply empty because no one wanted to risk their ships in a war zone. The taxes that should have been flowing into the treasury were not flowing. The gold that should have been available to pay debts was not there. Cersei, after her walk of shame, was released from the Faith's custody. But she was broken, humiliated, desperate. She had lost control of King's Landing, lost control of her son, lost control of everything she had worked for. She still had some power, still had allies, but she was no longer the Queen Regent in anything but name. The Faith dominated the city. The Tyrells were plotting against her. Her enemies were circling, and the debts remained. Always the debts, hanging over everything, making every decision more desperate, every move more dangerous. The realm was bleeding gold, bleeding it into wars that accomplished nothing, into alliances that crumbled, into schemes that failed. The crown had borrowed millions to fund Robert's excesses and Joffrey's wars, and now there was nothing to show for it. Nothing except corpses and ruined castles and empty treasuries. The great houses that had lent to the crown were trapped by their own investments, could not demand payment without destroying the regime they had propped up, could not walk away without losing everything they had put in. But the Iron Bank was not trapped. The Iron Bank could walk away any time, could write off the debt as a loss and move on, could find new clients and new investments. The only reason it stayed involved, the only reason it continued to care about Westeros and its endless wars, was pride, principle, the absolute certainty that the Iron Bank would have its due, that no debt, no matter how large or how unlikely to be repaid, would be forgotten or forgiven, that the bank's reputation for always collecting was worth more than any single loan. This was the difference between the Iron Bank and the Westerosi creditors. The Lannisters and Tyrells had political interests, had family interests, had reasons to care about who sat the Iron Throne beyond simple financial calculation. The Faith had spiritual interests, had a vision for how the realm should be ruled, had goals beyond profit and repayment. But the Iron Bank had only one interest, only one goal, only one vision. The debt would be paid, the account would balance, the numbers would work out in the end. And if that required waiting years or decades, the Iron Bank would wait. If it required backing multiple claimants, one after another, until one finally succeeded, the bank would do that. If it required sending envoys across the world to negotiate with dragon queens and bastard kings and religious fanatics, the bank would do that too. Whatever was necessary, whatever it took, the debt would be collected. The leverage the Iron Bank had was simple and absolute. It could destroy any regime by withdrawing support, by refusing to lend more, by calling in existing debts at the worst possible moment, by backing that regime's enemies. This leverage did not require armies or dragons or political alliances. It just required gold and patience, and the absolute certainty that eventually someone would need to borrow. Someone would be desperate enough to agree to any terms. Someone would pay. Right now, everyone in Westeros was desperate. The crown was desperate. The great houses were desperate. The Faith was desperate in its own way, desperate to impose its vision of righteousness on a sinful realm. Even the small folk were desperate, starving and suffering while their lords played their games of thrones. Desperation was everywhere, and desperation was exactly what the Iron Bank needed, because desperate people make bad decisions, take loans they cannot afford, agree to terms they will regret, promise things they cannot deliver. And when those loans come due, when those terms must be honoured, when those promises must be kept, the desperate borrowers discover the truth. The Iron Bank does not care about your desperation, does not care about your excuses, does not care about your very good reasons for why you cannot pay. It cares only about the contract, about the agreement, about the debt. The War of the Five Kings was winding down. Most of the kings were dead. Robb Stark murdered at the Red Wedding. Renly Baratheon killed by shadow magic. Balon Greyjoy dead in a fall that might have been an accident, or might have been murder. Only Stannis and Tommen remained, only two claimants still fighting for the throne. The realm was exhausted, bleeding, desperate for peace, desperate for stability, desperate for someone, anyone, to bring the wars to an end and let people rebuild their lives. But peace required gold, required resources to repair what had been destroyed, required food to feed the hungry, required materials to rebuild castles and cities and farms, required everything that the realm no longer had, everything that had been spent or stolen or burned in the wars. And the only place to get that gold was to borrow it, to take on more debt, to dig the hole even deeper. The Iron Bank watched and waited. Watched the realm destroy itself. Watched the debts pile higher. Watched the desperation grow. And prepared for the moment when someone would come begging. When someone would need the bank's gold so badly that they would agree to anything, would promise anything, would bind themselves and their kingdom to repayment terms that would take generations to fulfill. That moment was coming. Soon. Very soon. And when it came, the Iron Bank would be ready, would have its terms prepared, would have its contracts written, would have its envoys standing by to negotiate. Because this was what the Iron Bank did. This was its purpose, its function, its reason for existing. To lend when others could not. To profit from desperation. To ensure that no matter what happened, no matter how the world changed, one thing remained constant. The Iron Bank will have its due, always, forever, without exception, without mercy, without end. The debt would be paid, the account would balance, the numbers would work out. This was not hope, not belief, not faith. This was certainty, mathematical, absolute, unchangeable. The Iron Bank would have its due. Winter had come to Westeros, not the metaphorical winter of war and suffering, not the political winter of chaos and collapse, but real winter. The white ravens had flown from the citadel. The snows were falling across the north and creeping south. The cold was settling in, and with it came a reckoning that went beyond gold and debt. A reckoning that would test whether any of the southern kingdoms even survived to repay what they owed. The Iron Bank watched this from across the narrow sea, watched the snows fall, watched the reports come in from its agents in Westeros, watched the realm struggle to feed itself as the harvests failed, and the stores ran low. Winter in Westeros was not like winter in the free cities. Braavos had cold winters, yes, but nothing like what was coming to the Seven Kingdoms. Nothing like the years of darkness and frost that the old stories promised. The Iron Bank had lived through winters before, had seen realms survive and realms collapse, had learned that winter was when debts became most dangerous, when kingdoms discovered whether their foundations were solid or built on sand. The crown's position was worse than anyone wanted to admit. Tommen sat the Iron Throne, but his power was an illusion. King's Landing was controlled by the Faith Militant. The High Sparrow held more real authority than the ape boy king. Cersei was plotting her revenge, but she was isolated, weakened, discredited. The Tyrells were trapped in their alliance with the Crown, unable to abandon it, but unable to profit from it either. And the debts remained. 6 million gold dragons, maybe more. The exact number hardly mattered anymore, because there was no way to pay even a fraction of it. The Crown's income had collapsed completely. The North was independent under whoever ruled Winterfell now. The Riverlands were devastated. The Stormlands were barely controlled. The Vale had closed itself off under Littlefinger's influence. Only the Crownlands, the Westerlands, and the Reach remained even nominally loyal. And even those regions were struggling. Trade had stopped. Taxes were not being collected. The small folk were starving. There was no gold flowing into the treasury. No way to pay soldiers, or buy food, or maintain any semblance of government. Stannis was fighting in the north. Last reports said he was marching on Winterfell, trying to take it from the Boltons who had seized it after betraying and murdering Robb Stark. The Iron Bank's gold was funding this campaign, paying his sellswords, keeping his army in the field despite the impossible conditions. Tycho Nestoris was with him, watching the investment, making sure Stannis did not waste the bank's resources, making sure he remained focused on his goal, the throne, the crown, the prize that would allow him to repay everything he owed. But the Iron Bank was beginning to have doubts, not about Stannis's character. He was exactly what he appeared to be, dutiful, determined, honourable in his own rigid way. But character was not enough to win wars, especially not wars fought in winter against enemies who held castles and knew the terrain. Stannis's army was suffering. The cold was killing men. The snow was making movement almost impossible. The supplies were running low, despite the gold spent to buy them. If Stannis failed, if he died at Winterfell, or retreated, or simply froze to death in the north, then the Iron Bank's investment would be lost. This was not catastrophic for the bank. One failed investment among thousands. The bank had survived worse, but it was frustrating, and it raised questions about strategy, about whether Westeros was worth the continued effort, about whether the realm was simply too broken to ever stabilize enough to pay its debts. Some in the Iron Bank argued for writing off the Westerosi debts entirely, declaring them uncollectible, moving on to more profitable markets. Essos was vast. There were always opportunities, always new clients, always new investments. Why waste resources on a frozen, war-torn peninsula that might never be able to pay what it owed? But others argued differently, argued that the Iron Bank's reputation depended on never giving up, never accepting loss, never allowing a debt to go unpaid. If the bank wrote off 6 million dragons, if it accepted that some kingdoms were too chaotic to collect from, then every other client would see that, would understand that there were conditions under which the bank gave up, would understand that if you made things difficult enough, messy enough, impossible enough, the bank would eventually walk away. This could not be allowed, could not be tolerated, because the moment clients believed they could escape their debts through chaos, they would create chaos deliberately, would burn their own kingdoms to avoid payment. So the debate within the Iron Bank continued, and while it continued, the bank hedged its bets, continued supporting Stannis, but also looked at other options, other possible winners, other potential clients who might someday control Westeros and be willing to honour its debts. Daenerys Targaryen remained the most interesting possibility. She had left Meereen, according to reports, had disappeared into the Dothraki Sea. Some said she was dead. Others said she had been captured by a Khalasar. Still, others said she was gathering a new army, flying on her dragon across the grasslands, building power for another attempt at conquering Slaver's Bay, or perhaps finally turning west toward Westeros. The reports were contradictory, unclear. The Iron Bank's agents in Essos were trying to find her, to make contact, to establish a relationship before she made her move. But Daenerys was proving elusive. There were other possibilities too. Aegon Targaryen, another claimant to the throne, another lost Targaryen supposedly returned from the dead. He had landed in the Stormlands with the Golden Company, was fighting to take Storm's End, was claiming to be the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Elia Martell, the son who was supposed to have been murdered during Robert's rebellion, but who somehow survived. Whether this was true, or whether he was a pretender, hardly mattered to the Iron Bank. What mattered was whether he could win, whether he could take the throne, whether he would honour the debts owed by previous regimes. The Iron Bank sent envoys to Aegon as well. Carefully, quietly, offered support, offered loans, offered everything the bank had offered Stannis, because the bank did not care which Targaryen sat the throne, did not care which Baratheon, or which pretender, or which anyone. It cared only that whoever won understood the debt, acknowledged it, promised to pay it. This was the genius of the Iron Bank's strategy. It did not need to pick the right winner. It just needed to make sure that every possible winner knew about the debt, knew that the Iron Bank expected payment, knew that refusing payment would bring consequences. By spreading its support across multiple claimants, by making sure everyone who might win owed the bank something, it ensured that no matter the outcome, the bank would have leverage, would have a claim, would have a path to collecting what it was owed. But there was another factor the Iron Bank had to consider, something that went beyond normal political calculations, beyond the usual analysis of armies and alliances and who was likely to win. The rumours from the north, the stories about the dead walking, about an army of ice and darkness marching on the wall, about the Night's Watch barely holding, about ancient evils waking. Most in Essos dismissed these stories as superstition, Westerosi peasants seeing ghosts and monsters in every shadow, telling old campfire tales to frighten children. The Iron Bank was more careful. The Iron Bank investigated. It had lent gold to Jon Snow and the Night's Watch, had sent Tycho Nestoris to the Wall, had received reports from him about what he had seen, about the wildlings fleeing south, about the fear in the eyes of the Night's Watch brothers, about the things they described, the things they claimed to have fought. Tycho Nestoris was not a superstitious man, was not prone to believing in fairy tales, but his reports were concerning. He did not claim to have seen the dead walking, did not claim to have proof of ancient evil. But he did say that the men at the wall believed, that they were genuinely terrified, that they were preparing for something far worse than wildling raids. And Tycho trusted his own observations, trusted that men who had spent their lives at the wall, who knew the North better than anyone, were not easily frightened. If the stories were true, if there really was some kind of supernatural threat beyond the wall, then it changed everything, changed the entire calculation about Westeros. Because if the realm fell to ice and death, if the population was wiped out or driven south into Essos as refugees, then there would be no one left to pay the debts, no kingdom to collect from, no way to recoup the investment. The Iron Bank would lose everything it had lent, not just to the crown, but to every merchant and lord and institution in Westeros. This was unacceptable, so the Iron Bank had to consider the possibility seriously, had to plan for it, had to think about what it would do if the threat was real. The answer, surprisingly, was not to abandon Westeros, not to write it off as doomed, but to invest more, to support the defense, to help whoever was fighting this threat to survive. Because a Westeros that survived meant debts that could be collected. A Westeros that fell meant total loss. This was why the loan to the Night's Watch made sense. Why supporting Jon Snow's efforts to defend the Wall was actually good business. Not charity, not sentiment, but cold calculation. If the Wall fell, if the North was overrun, if the entire continent descended into chaos worse than any civil war, then the bank lost everything. Better to spend some gold now to prevent that, to give the defenders a chance, to ensure that there was still a realm left when the wars of succession finally ended. The Iron Bank also began to consider more aggressive strategies, more direct intervention. It had always operated through loans and leverage, through financial pressure and careful diplomacy. But what if that was not enough? What if Westeros needed more than gold? What if it needed armies? Actual military intervention from Essos? The Iron Bank could fund that, could hire every sellsword company in Essos, could outfit a fleet, could land an army in Westeros and impose stability by force, not to conquer, not to rule, but to stabilize, to create a government capable of functioning, capable of collecting taxes and paying debts, capable of being a reliable client. This would be expensive, extraordinarily expensive. But it would also be an investment, a way to protect all the gold the bank had already lent, a way to ensure that Westeros did not simply collapse into total chaos. And once stability was imposed, once a functioning government was in place, the bank could step back, could return to its normal role as creditor, could collect its debts over the next decades or centuries. The short-term cost would be high, but the long-term gain would justify it. These discussions were ongoing within the Iron Bank. No decisions had been made yet. But the fact that they were even being considered showed how seriously the bank took the situation, showed how much it had invested in Westeros, showed how determined it was to collect what it was owed. Meanwhile, in Westeros itself, the people had no idea how much their fate was being decided by bankers in Braavos. The lords and ladies played their games of thrones, fought their wars, made their alliances, plotted their revenges, and never understood that the real power, the real force shaping their world, was not sitting in any castle, was not commanding any army, was not wearing any crown. It was sitting in a grey stone building across the narrow sea, counting coins, recording debts, planning strategies, waiting. The small folk understood even less. They suffered and starved and died, and thought their misery was caused by the wars, by the bad kings and cruel lords, by the gods' displeasure, or simple bad luck. They did not understand that their suffering was, in part, a consequence of debt, that the gold their lords owed had to come from somewhere, had to be extracted from someone, and that someone was always them. The farmers whose crops were seized, the merchants whose goods were taxed, the workers whose wages were reduced, the people who had never borrowed anything but who paid for their lord's excesses nonetheless. This was the hidden influence of the Iron Bank, not just the direct loans to kings and lords, but the ripple effects, the ways that debt shaped every decision, made every war more brutal because commanders could not afford to lose quickly, made every negotiation more desperate because creditors were waiting, made every winter more terrible because there was no gold left for relief, no reserves to fall back on. Everything had already been borrowed, already been spent, already been promised to the Iron Bank and the other creditors. If you wanted to understand the war of The Five Kings, you could not just look at the battles and the betrayals. You had to look at the debts, at who owed what to whom, at which houses were trapped by their loans, at which kings were fighting not just for glory or legitimacy, but because they desperately needed to win so they could loot their enemies and pay what they owed. The entire war, in a sense, was a financial crisis playing out in blood and steel, and the Iron Bank had helped cause that crisis, had enabled Robert's excesses by lending him gold, had allowed the crown to dig itself deeper and deeper into debt, had made it possible for Joffrey to wage war instead of negotiating peace. The bank bore responsibility for the suffering, for the chaos, for the hundreds of thousands dead, not sole responsibility. The kings and lords made their own choices, but the bank had enabled those choices, had provided the gold that made them possible. Did the Iron Bank care about this? Did it feel guilt for the role it had played? No. The Iron Bank felt nothing, was not a person, was an institution. It had no conscience, no moral sense beyond the simple rule that debts must be paid. It did what it was designed to do: lent money, collected debts, maximized returns. If that caused suffering, if that created chaos, if that led to hundreds of thousands of deaths, that was not the bank's concern. That was the concern of kings and lords and the people they ruled. The bank's only concern was the numbers, the ledgers, the accounts, and by those measures, the bank was doing exactly what it should. Some fan theories suggest the Iron Bank has even deeper plans, that it is not just collecting debts, but actively trying to shape Westeros, to create a government more favorable to trade and finance, to break the power of the old nobility and replace it with a system where merchants and bankers have more influence, where blood matters less and gold matters more, where institutions like the Iron Bank can operate freely without interference from proud lords who look down on trade. If this is true, if the Iron Bank is not just reacting to events, but actively pushing Westeros toward a particular future, then its influence is even more profound than it appears. Then every loan is not just about profit, but about power, about creating dependencies, about making the Westerosi nobility understand that they need the bank, that they cannot survive without it, that their old ways, their pride in ancient bloodlines, and their contempt for commerce are obsolete. But this is speculation, theory. The books do not confirm it. The bank's representatives never speak of grand plans or visions for Westeros's future. They speak only of debts and payments and contracts. If there is a deeper agenda, it is hidden beneath layers of financial pragmatism, concealed behind the facade of simple banking. What is certain is this: the Iron Bank will have its due. Whether Stannis wins, or Daenerys invades, or Aegon takes the throne, or someone else entirely emerges victorious. Whether the threat from beyond the wall is real or just superstition. Whether Westeros survives the winter or collapses into ruin. One way or another, the debt will be addressed. The account will balance. The gold will flow back to Braavos. This is not prophecy, not prediction, not hope. This is mathematical certainty. Because the Iron Bank has been doing this for centuries, has survived the fall of kingdoms and the rise of empires, has outlasted dynasties and religions and entire civilizations. It will outlast the current chaos in Westeros, will outlast whoever sits the Iron Throne, will outlast everyone currently involved in the wars and the politics and the schemes. And when the dust settles, when the history of this era is written, the historians will note that through it all, One institution remained constant. One principle held true. One debt was never forgotten. The Iron Bank will have its due. If you have been following the story of the Iron Bank through this entire journey, if you have walked with Tychonosaurus from Braavos to the Wall, if you have watched the debts pile up and the kingdoms crumble, then you understand something important about power. Real power is not always visible, does not always wear crowns or swing swords. Sometimes it sits quietly in an office, in a grey stone building, counting coins, recording numbers, waiting for the world to learn what the free cities have known for centuries. That gold is more powerful than steel. That debt is more binding than oaths. That the Iron Bank will have its due. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us what you think about the Iron Bank's role in Westeros. Do you see them as villains enabling chaos? As neutral parties just doing business? Or as the only rational actors in a realm gone mad? And more importantly, who do you think will end up paying these debts? Will Stannis survive long enough to honour his promises? Will Daenerys acknowledge the obligations of previous rulers? Will someone entirely unexpected emerge to settle accounts with Braavos? Let us know what you think. And if you want more deep dives into the hidden forces shaping the world of ice and fire, you know what to do. Subscribe, because there are more secrets to uncover, more connections to trace, more truths hiding beneath the surface of the story. The Iron Bank's tale is just one thread in a vast tapestry, and we are here to help you see the whole picture.